Hello there, and welcome to the 11th episode of Dev Conversations by SwiftToolkit.dev, where we host developers that contribute to the Swift tooling ecosystem. Today we have the pleasure to host Finn Voorhees, who is an iOS developer, but also the person behind PlaydateKit, a Swift wrapper over the Playdate SDK. Hey Finn.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Sure, thanks for accepting. As I do in every episode, tell me a little bit about your first steps in programming.
Yeah, sort of self-taught. When I was younger, I was looking at like HTML and JS at first with Codecademy, things like that, just going through different tutorials, mostly for JavaScript and just making little websites, just kind of simple things. And then I got pretty interested in like Arduino, which is kind of education focused microcontroller board, just like lighting up LEDs, pushing buttons, making little synthesizers, stuff like that, which uses, I think it's a slightly modified C++ as the programming language. So that was kind of how I got a little bit more knowledgeable on the, more traditional programming languages, C and C++.
How old were you back then?
I was probably 12 to 14, um, just learning like microcontrollers, building simple websites. I was also pretty interested in like game development, so things like Unity, which is C sharp, but mostly like laying things out visually in their editor. So as far as like actually sort of diving into full-on programming, it was more so when I was in high school and early college where I started looking at like making iOS apps, just kind of little tools to help me out with tasks that I needed, like a bus schedule or things like a metronome. And then I studied computer engineering and maths in university, which was more traditional computer programming courses like C++, things like that, with a little bit of electrical engineering as well. So that's sort of my background in programming.
Yeah, very cool. And this already takes us a little bit to the topic of PlaydateKit, which is it. I think it combines a little bit of everything that you mentioned, right? It's a little bit of embedded and games, and brings the Swift world of iOS development.
Yeah, I think that's sort of why I like working on it so much, is because, it's not just like an iOS app or an embedded thing or Swift. It is combining all of those things. And I think it's sort of not something traditionally done with Swift or um, even like as an iOS developer, you sort of think of Swift as just programming language for making iOS apps, macOS apps. And I think the cool thing we're seeing in the past few years is that's kind of
It's a
changing.
push for a different direction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all of the past interviews you've done about, Swift on server, embedded Swift, it's just really cool to see that kind of ecosystem coming together.
Yeah. And technically, how Swift for embedded differs from regular Swift. There are a few constraints, right?
Yeah, there's definitely constraints. I think when people think about it, they think it's going to be like completely different and you're going to have to do all these workarounds, which at the start there were definitely some limitations. When I first started working on PlaydateKit, I was running into like compiler crashes pretty much every few days. But the team at Apple were working on developing embedded Swift, were really receptive to like all the crash reports and everything. And especially like the past year, it's gotten a lot better. So
Yeah, because probably when you started was still a custom toolchain, right? Wasn't in the main.
yeah, I think I don't know if it's actually in like the Xcode shipping toolchain yet. Maybe the latest beta, but yeah, you sort of do still need to install the nightly toolchains to get all the up-to-date features. But with the release of Swiftly for macOS, that's gotten a lot better. You can just swiftly install latest, and everything's automatically set up for you. You have like the Swift version defined, in your project and everything's handled. But
But
I think
language-wise, I think I remember that strings have some limitations. No, they
yeah, you don't really run into them that much, but there are limitations like for advanced Unicode features, you need to bundle Unicode UTF-8 tables, I think it is, which adds some code size, which is why it's not enabled by default. And that's just for, I don't remember exactly what string operations is for, but it's sort of the more advanced ones you wouldn't use as often. So I haven't even run into with PlaydateKit needing them. It was supported for a while and then I accidentally broke it and haven't gotten around to fixing it yet. But also things like floating point interpolation, like printing out a float, isn't currently enabled in embedded Swift because I guess it's hard to do without allocations. So that's one of the main limitations at the moment, at least for when you're making games, because you can't just say like print this value when debugging. You have to either convert it to an int or add your own basic floating point conversion. Because there is also the no allocations mode of embedded Swift, where it disables any functionality that requires allocations. And I guess that's for kind of lower level embedded coding where you're running on really weak hardware where you need that extra
yeah, more
performance and
memory
code size.
constrained devices.
Yeah, but I think for like hobbyist embedded development, you wouldn't really run into that because, the difference between a little microcontroller with a small amount of RAM versus a bit more is maybe $1 for the chip. So you can kind of buy the slightly more expensive $5 microcontroller board versus $4 and have a better development experience.
Would you have any tips for people who would like to get a little more into this? Are there any kits that are more compatible with Swift or any
Yeah, there's
tutorials that you
definitely,
might know?
I would say the Swift embedded examples is the best place to start, which is linked to on swift.org with their new redesign now. It's featuring embedded front and center alongside server side, which is really nice. But if you go to the Swift embedded examples, it's a few ESP boards, like a ESP32C6, I think, which is kind of like a smart home board, which has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So there's an example for creating like a HomeKit LED, just lighting up a LED with HomeKit, which is pretty cool because it's interacting with HomeKit on iOS, which Swift developers are probably fairly familiar with. And then there's a few for Raspberry Pi Pico as well, which is more aimed, I think, at hobbyist and education. So I think probably just picking one of the boards where there's already an example for, then you don't really have to worry about, is this compatible? Do I have to figure out the build system? You can just kind of copy and paste the example and then
Yeah,
start playing with it.
the starter
Yeah.
projects.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's, I think, one of the biggest focuses at the moment on the Swift team is just improving the documentation and just figuring out how to make it easier for people to get started.
And back to PlaydateKit, can you tell us a little bit more of what you've been adding support for in the recent months?
Yeah, I mean, mostly one of the biggest things is just trying to wrap as much of the Playdate C API as possible because the Swift Playdate Kit is kind of based on the C SDK. Playdate Kit is really just Swift wrappers around the C API, which means that you can do anything you can with the C API or the Lua API just in Swift. And the goal of Playdate Kit was just to make it more idiomatic when using Swift.
And
Because,
safer, like wrapping everything in Doka,
yeah,
like
exactly. The whole inspiration for PlaydateKit was the blog post on Swift.org by Raul, who is working at Apple on embedded Swift. It was kind of the proof of concept showing you can use the C API